right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our September Be Well Lunch and Learn. We are so excited to have David Simmons join us today. He is the Director of Pastoral Care here at Penn State Hershey Medical Center. So we always love to have an internal speaker with us. Today, he's going to be talking about the stories we tell ourselves, so how our narratives shape our lives, work, and well-being. But before I pass it off to him, I do want to give two reminders. The first being that we do record these, so if you're unable to stay for the entire length of the session, you will be receiving a recording in your inbox within about a week or so. And then we also place these on our Be Well website as well. And so you can visit that website and see all the lunch and learns that we've hosted over the past couple years. Also, if you have any questions or comments throughout today's session, feel free to use the chat box feature or the Q&A, and we will get to as many as time allows for. So with that, I will pass this over to David.
Well, Angela, thank you. And it's a privilege to be back and presenting again at the Be Well monthly Lunch and Learn. And for the last time I did this, it was in 2019, live and in person. And we had no idea how much would change both in our health system and through COVID. So a lot has happened since I was able to do this last. And so I'm very excited to be back and to sharing again in this new virtual format. And, really, I talk about a lot has happened since COVID. And a lot of what I want to talk about today is related to some of the outworkings of COVID and the way I've seen us as professionals kind of develop our response to things related to storytelling. I've often thought in terms of the fact that we as human beings, we are constantly interpreting reality around us. It's just what we do. And we often talk about it in terms of assumption making or jumping to conclusions, we might call it. But what I want to talk about today is thinking about it in terms of storytelling. We do a lot of storytelling. We tell ourselves narratives all the time. In fact, just this morning, someone was telling me about a narrative that was being formed around a patient and a family. And once these narratives are formed, they're really hard to break apart. And I've been thinking a lot over the last year about how we tell stories. We tell stories to ourselves, and they impact the way we see the world around us, and they impact the way we engage one another, and ultimately impact our work life, our personal life, our relationships, and our well-being. So we're going to deep dive into that today. And I'm hoping that this will be a kind of a relaxed presentation. I don't have a lot of intense slides in terms of content. This is not something that I would expect you to sit and take notes about or, memorize any kind of outlines or anything. This is really just about sitting back. I hope you got your lunch with you. This is a lunch and learn, that you're in a place where you can kind of reflect on your own well-being, your own storytelling, the narratives that really are shaping your day-to-day life. And to help you, my hope is to gain some awareness around that, to have some knowledge and understanding and awareness around the stories that you're telling about the world around you and how it's impacting the way you engage one another. So that's our goal for today. So we'll talk about storytelling in general. I'm going to give some background to that, then talk about how it impacts us as individuals in our individual lives, and then close with some takeaways about kind of how we can tell better stories in our lives. So with that, I have to tell you, it was a wonderful summer to see us slowly but surely recovering from the fallout of COVID. And I think nothing really symbolized that more than the fact that we all went to the movies this summer. These are the three movies that I saw. I saw Barbie. I mean, who didn't, right? I saw Oppenheimer. And here's the wild card of the summer. I loved Mission Impossible. And I'm no longer recommending the movie because everybody had recommended it too. I think I overhyped it. And then they came back and told me it wasn't as great as I thought. I thought it was a great movie. So I'm going to put that on the slide alongside Barbie and Oppenheimer, which were, of course, big topics of conversation in our culture. And it just reminds us that we love a good story. And stories aren't just entertaining, but they are formative in the way we see, interpret, and understand the world. And a classic case in point is Barbie. I thought Barbie was going to be the most superficial movie at best. How complex of a movie can you build around a Barbie doll, right? And so I was quite surprised that Barbie, historically and anatomically incorrect doll that brings shame to women everywhere because they can't live up to this ideal. I thought, well, what kind of movie can you build around that? And boy, was I surprised to walk away and find out that Barbie is a very feminist hero of ours now. We recast Barbie, right? We redefined Barbie as someone who, in fact, if you look at the subtitle of the movie poster itself, she's everything, he's just Ken, which that truly was the movie. She was this all-around, well-developed, insightful person, powerful leader, and Ken was just, hopelessly lost in his toxic masculinity, right? But this was a way for a story to reinvent a narrative that we as a culture had a lot of conversation about. The same was true with Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer really had a powerful impact for me of really thinking, yeah, we now live in a world where there's an atomic bomb, where in the wrong hands, we have now the potential to destroy ourselves. And even the man who created the bomb himself, by the end was saying, I don't know what we've done. We have recreated our world. We've recreated our future. And so it was a very reflective piece where the creator of the atomic bomb becomes the one who warns us about the effects of the atomic bomb in the nuclear age. And then, of course, what I loved about Mission Impossible is that it is a classic story. It's the story of most movies. It's the story of every Marvel movie. It's the story of every DC comic movie. It's the story of every James Bond movie. It's the same plot, really, just with different characters. And that is, evil comes about, a flawed hero steps in, and with their flawed nature, joins forces to overcome evil, and good defeats evil at the end. I mean, that is the story of humanity. It's the story we all long for. It's the story we all hope for and believe in. And it's the story that we'll pay a lot of money to go see in the movies, and we'll see it with great regularity. So stories still have a real high impact in our culture. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the ultimate storyteller, and that is none other than Pennsylvania's own Taylor Swift. I mean, right? Should I call her a billionaire? Because I think she might be a billionaire now. Who knows? But talk about the power of a story. Let me make a comment that's probably going to light up the chat box. I don't know, but I kind of am curious about what made Taylor Swift so popular, because quite honestly, her voice is probably slightly above average in terms of famous singers, right? I mean, there's a lot of great singers in the world, and I don't know that her voice really is all that distinguishable from those great singers. I watched the movie about the life of Whitney Houston. I mean, Whitney Houston had the ultimate voice, and she even told her producer, the only songs I want to sing are songs that really show off my vocal range. Well, that's not really Taylor Swift. So what makes Taylor Swift a superstar? Well, I think it's around the fact that every one of her songs tells a story. Wonderful stories in her songs. You can't listen to the first 30 seconds of a Taylor Swift song and not want to hear the whole thing to know how the story ends. And so she has leveraged the power of storytelling to launch herself into superstar status. So yes, the power of stories in our culture still are strong. But let's go back a little bit. Where does storytelling fit in our history? Well, it's interesting because storytelling has always been a part of us. We operate out of a scientific mind. We live on this side of the scientific method. We live on this side of logic, rational reason. We use that in problem solving in everyday life. But imagine there was a time not too long ago in human history where we just didn't think that way. In fact, there was even a time where we didn't even understand the concept of history as we now know it. That date is around 700 BC. Prior to 700 BC, there wasn't even the mentality to be able to think in terms of history. Like one event, there is events that occur, there are dates, there are times, there are places. Those events lead to other events, which there's causality, and then there's patterns created throughout history. We didn't even have that as a way of thinking prior to about 700 BC. So for much of human history, we have not had science to guide our thinking. We've not even had history to guide our thinking. We have had stories. Stories go back as far as the formation of language itself. We can go all the way back to those first sketchings in the in caves, where we see stories being carved out on the ancient walls. And essentially, storytelling was about this. These natural events occurred, and someone had to tell a story to explain them. We didn't have science to explain them. We didn't have history to explain them. We just had stories, and stories were a big part of how we made meaning to the world, how we understood things. So lightning would strike. We had no idea what that meant. So we would write stories. It's the gods at war with one another, or an earthquake would shake the world, or a flood would occur. These events would happen, and there was no way to understand what they meant. But the human mind is driven towards making meaning and making sense of what it sees. And the way we've always done it throughout human history is we've written and told and shared stories. My wife and I and my son and his girlfriend, we had an opportunity earlier this year to go to ancient Greece and see the sites. And let me tell you what a life-changing moment it is to see things that are what we call prehistory. Before we could think in terms of historical thought, we were thinking in terms of stories, and we went back and saw the ancient ruins of really that were formed out of these story narratives. And what you're looking at here is just outside of the little town of Delphi, in this beautiful mountainside. There's this massive complex that it contains. At the top right, you'll see there, right in the center of that image, is the Temple of Apollo. And then right above that is a massive stadium, and above that is a Roman athletic field, just a massive complex of ancient ruins. And here in the center of it is the Temple of Apollo. Well, Apollo was the god of love, the god of language, the god of art, the god of poetry, the god of music, the god of philosophy, all those things that bring rich texture to our lives. This was the temple built to Apollo. Now, above the earth, up in the sky, is where Zeus lived. Zeus was Apollo's father. Now, Zeus, being the god of the sky, had all power and authority, right? And so Zeus one day, so the story goes, and again, this is a story that's been formative to our own culture. He sent out two eagles, one to the eastern end of the world and one to the western end of the world. And this was in search of to find the center of the universe, the center of the world. And so he sent these two eagles out to the far stretches of the earth, and those two eagles came back. And wherever they came back together, that would be the center of the world. And that picture on the bottom right, imagine the two eagles. The legend says they came right through that little opening where the two mountains meet, and the two eagles came right through there, and they landed right at the spot that you see on the left, and they marked that spot, and that spot is the navel of the world. This was the center of the universe. Now, if you think about this story for a minute, it makes no literal sense at all, does it? I mean, certainly not scientifically. This is not the center of the universe, right? It's not. Throughout history, I don't even know how history would apply to this story. But if we go back and we look at it from their point of view, what we want to call this is a myth, because it was a myth. Now, when you and I think of myth, we often think of this being a false story. You know, we'll say that, well, that's just a myth, as if it's a false story, because that's how we think. We think in terms of, is it true or is it false? So is this a true story or is it a false story? Well, that's not the center of the universe, so that's definitely a false story. That's not how the ancient mind thought. The ancient mind wasn't looking at facts and right and wrong. It was looking at what's the meaning of our lives, right? And what this symbolizes is that where the power of Zeus and the love of art and poetry and philosophy meet, that point is the height of human civilization. That is the center point of what it means to be a human being. And in that respect, it's a story that has a lot of rich meaning to it, because I think you and I would agree, we are people who love art, poetry, music, philosophy. These are things that we've aspired to learn, to grow, and to help enrich our lives. So even though we would call this a myth, or we would call this an inaccurate story, the ancients wouldn't have thought of that. They told stories to try to understand, what does life mean? What brings us value? What brings us worth? What brings us a sense of purpose? So I offer this to simply tell you, you can look at ruins all around the world, and you can see that we've been telling stories since we first walked on this earth. Stories are how we make sense of the world. We are just wired to tell stories. But here's the question: why do we tell stories? Why are stories such an innate part of what it means to be human? Why do stories come to us so naturally? Yes, it is a trait of simply being human. Stories are how we capture those big questions: who we are, where do we come from, where are we going, why do things happen, why do events occur? We use storytelling to make sense of those questions and sense of those realities. Stories also help us build a dynasty of meaning. This is where many world religions really come into play. We often kind of come up with this dichotomy of, are you religious or you're not religious? Which I kind of, as a person of faith, I find it to be a kind of a false dynamic or false division, because we are all telling the story, or we're all telling stories, and we're all asking the questions: who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? What is the meaning to life? Why are things happening? Why are we the way we are? We're all asking those questions. The question is whether you're asking that independently or through some philosophical framework, or artistic framework, personal framework, or for me and many others, we choose a religious framework, which simply means that I'm asking those questions in the context of a history, the Christian history in particular for me, that goes back to thousands of years of traditions of people building story upon story to try to wrestle with these fundamental questions. So even religion really is just a collection point of stories to try to build a dynasty of meaning. Also, we like stories because they capture complex patterns of reality and truth. Life is not simple, and stories can capture that. I'm even thinking of my own faith tradition. There were folks that asked Jesus, who is my neighbor, right? Well, if we were to ask that today, we would just look up the definition of neighbor, right? A very technical answer is what we would probably come up with, but it would be too simplistic. And so Jesus doesn't answer that with a dictionary definition. He tells a story. He says there was a man walking down one day, and he got beat up. He got attacked on the side of the road, and 3 people walked by. One was a priest, one was a Levite, and one was the ultimate scum of the earth, a Samaritan, somebody that nobody liked. But who was the hero of the story? Who was the neighbor? It was the one that you would least expect it. So why does Jesus tell a story like that? Because it captures the complexity of what it means to be neighbor versus a simple dictionary definition. So stories help us do that, capture the complex realities that we deal with. Stories help us capture the human drama. It's why we go to movies. It's why we go to Broadway shows. It's why we enjoy a good narrative. And then ultimately, stories help us make sense and meaning of reality. So stories really are a healthy and natural part of what it means to be human, is that we create stories to capture the complexity of our reality, the complexity of our experience with reality, and the meaning that we get from life. However, stories can also be a little tricky, And that's really where I want us to focus today. I don't know if you've ever had the chance to go out and look up at the stars in a dark sky situation. That happened to me when I was about 10 years old. I was living in Dallas, Texas, and talk about light pollution. I only thought literally there were 8 or 10 stars in the universe because that's all I ever saw living in Dallas. And I remember one time we went on a camping trip and with a bunch of guys, and we went way, way out into the middle of nowhere. And I remember we camped out in pitch darkness, and I remember us lying down and looking up at the sky and seeing this incredible display of stars. The photos I offer you here, the one on the right, I took about a month ago. I went out, I live in Elizabethtown, and I went out into a cornfield, and I knew which direction the Milky Way was. I couldn't see it, of course, and I aimed my camera, and I did a 30-second exposure, and I did all kinds of Photoshop work on it just to see if I could pull any hint of the Milky Way out of that image. And this is what I got. That's about the best I could do. So where we live, we don't see stars like this, right? But this image on my left, my daughter went up into northern Pennsylvania, and I sent her with my camera and my tripod. She set it up, got the settings right, aimed it into the sky. And here's a better representation of what we see tonight. Imagine all these amazing stars that just fill the night sky. If you've ever seen that, you know what I'm talking about. But when I look at it, all I see is a big, massive ball of just a big array of stars. All I see is a bunch of lights dotting the sky. But what do the ancients see? So imagine the ancients, when they stare at that sky so many times that they no longer just saw a blanket of stars. Over time, what did they start to see? They started to see images in those stars. They started to see figures. They started to see animals in kings and gods. And then all of a sudden, this blanket of stars began to take on texture and meaning for them. Now, all of a sudden, they could see these images in the stars, and these images had power for them and power over them. Why is that important? It's important because you and I, as human beings, we can't help but see patterns and tell stories, even if we're just looking up at a blanket of stars. Even just looking up at a random pattern of stars, we look long enough, all of a sudden we create images and we create stories and we create narratives. And I would argue narratives aren't there. These are just a blanket of stars. We as human beings can't help but look at patterns can't help but look at data and information and not at some point see a pattern or a story. In fact, just really quickly, I have to point out that it is becoming a problem even in our own culture, is that we've become very conspiratorial about things. Just recently, we had the fires in Maui, and man, all people needed to know was there was a fire in Maui, and Oprah Winfrey owned some property that didn't burn. And all of a sudden, with those two simple data points, we had conspiracies going everywhere. We live in the age of conspiracies. Simply because we crave the patterns and connections. We don't like to say these are random acts of events that really have no correlation to one another. We look at events and we see patterns, and we're very susceptible to that as human beings, very susceptible to the point where there's an entire industry capitalizing on the quick way in which we believe narratives. We love to believe narratives. We believe stories, and people are very willing to give us narratives and stories that will fit a certain agenda that ultimately will create conflict in our world. Much of the conflict we experience today is around the quickness in which we believe, we see patterns and we believe stories, and then we hold tightly to those stories. And as voracious consumers of media, people are feeding us stories all the time. And mass media is constantly shaping our subconscious by telling us stories. And there are powerful people behind these stories that understand the power of a narrative. And they understand that once you hold to that story, it's very, very hard to let go of those stories. Because if you think about it, we really use stories to shape a tribal identity, right? So if you're a Democrat, or if you're a Republican, or if you're pro-mask, you're anti-mask, you're pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine, we really quickly as a society develop a very black and white view of things, a really hardened story that now we have a tribal identity related to that. And often that tribal identity means more to us than whether or not our story is true. So once you're connected into that tribal identity, it's really hard for us to critique our stories. And so I'm just pausing here to say we as a society have to get better at critiquing our own stories, because if we don't, people will give us stories all the time, and we will continue to divide as a society as people feed us stories that create animosity between one group of people and another. And it's gonna at some point become it's already impacting, I think, many of our well-being as we see our society fracturing over the kind of conflicts that we have. We ought to be very critical of those stories. I'm just offering that today to say we ought to be questioning those stories as well. But also, these tribal identities are very important to recognize, because even in our smaller scale, in our work units, or in our departments, or where we work, we can develop collective narratives that hold us together, give us some kind of tribal identity that may not be accurate. And then we feel like we're afraid to question the narrative because we could lose our place in that social environment. So the social cohesion of stories makes it very hard to critique our stories. And that's what I really want to talk about today. How do we critique those stories? So how do we as individuals use stories to make meaning of the world around us? And I think the important part is to say this, is that we are really good at taking a few facts, combining them with a few past experiences, and then creating full featured narratives out of which we live, act, and relate to one another. We can skim the top of the ocean and see very little, but our minds will create an entire narrative of what lies beneath the surface. We naturally do this all the time. Let me tell you a story of a colleague. Her name was Caroline. That was not really her name, but I'll call her Caroline. She was rudely interrupted one day by one of my other colleagues who she was known for doing that. She would get very anxious. She would run up, interrupt, and she would run off. Well, this colleague came up and interrupted Caroline, and Caroline immediately created a story. The story was that her colleague had no respect for her, had singly targeted her and singled her out and targeted her, and that she could not trust that colleague any longer because she felt that that colleague was trying to destroy her and her job. Now, all that was out of one encounter of a rude interruption. We were kind of shocked by it because she really held to the story. It became the story that impacted our work relationships together. One day I said to her, I said, you know, our colleague, I just want to let you know, just came up and kind of rudely just interrupted me to tell our group something. And I threw that out as a point of conversation to say maybe she's just someone who comes and occasionally her anxiety gets the best of her and she rudely interrupts and she's not really even aware she's doing it. And so I offered that to say maybe that was not personal about you. And I could see her face just kind of, drop a little bit as she began to realize that maybe she had created a story that wasn't true. But let me tell you something. Stories will always win. And for her, she went home, had a good night's sleep, came back, and the story was alive and well again. And she started targeting our colleague, believing that that colleague was after her. Because why? She had previous experiences in the past of someone having threatened her, who went to war with her in a work environment, and she ended up losing her job and losing her career and had to completely restructure her life. So out of that fear, she created the story that this is what was happening again. But here's the interesting way this story ends, and it's very sad, and it's sort of was the very first time I really started asking myself, what are we telling ourselves in terms of our stories? Well, out of that, she went in such conflict with that colleague that she ended up getting terminated from her job because it became such a toxic relationship. And she began to act out of that fear to the point where she ended up creating the very thing she feared. She was afraid that that colleague would destroy her career. And out of that fear, she ended up acting in a way that did ultimately cause her to lose her job and threaten her own career. This is the power of a story when we see only a little bit, and then we read beneath the surface to all these other things, and then we act on them. So this is what I want to caution us, is how do we question our stories? But first, let me just talk about the things that can shape our stories that we have to be very mindful of. We start with past experiences, right? We all have experiences, and the older we get, the more experiences we have. And so it doesn't take long before a new situation occurs and you recognize something that you've already experienced in the past. And while that is good for your, to bring experience into that situation, the negative part of that is we often project what happened in the past into the new situation. This happens quite often. We bring the result of our past experiences into a new situation, especially when there's past trauma. When there's past pain, those emotional wounds of the past can grow and take over our internal life and become the primary driver of the stories we tell about other people or how we read a situation. Our past trauma can really become present in the way we interpret new circumstances or new situations. And often, the earlier that pain occurs in our lives, the more challenging it is to overcome it because it's such a fundamental part of our experience. So past trauma can really shape the stories we tell. Of course, there's our culture, our political culture. Again, I mentioned that political narratives run very, very deep in the American culture. We hold to them very, very tightly. Religious stories about who's in and who's out, who can we trust, who can we not trust, are we being persecuted, are we not being persecuted? There's a lot of religious culture stories that are told, or geographical stories based on where we live in the country. There can be geographically dominant stories about how to interpret life and the world around us. And of course, there's our family of origin. Our family of origin creates the early templates for how we write stories the rest of our lives. So if you had a high conflict family, you're liable to project conflict in any kind of disagreement. If you had a low conflict family, conflict avoidant family, you're liable to write a story that causes you to avoid conflict in the future. How did your family model love? How did they model trust? How did they model conflict? How did they model control? Those are going to impact what you project onto the stories that you write about the situations that you are in. And then last, of course, I return us back to tribal identification. If we are a part of a group that holds to certain stories that unite that group together, it's very, very much going to shape the stories we tell in the future. And there's many, many examples of what we could use, but probably every one of them would generate conflict or discussion, so we won't go there. But you have an idea of what I'm talking about. So what are the types of stories we might tell that might not serve us well, right? A very popular one: people can't be trusted, or I know how this will end. We've seen this before, so we know how it's going to end, and so we already have an assumption about how an event or a circumstance might go. Or I can never let my guard down, right? So there may have been past conflicts that you develop this sense of defensiveness, and so I can never let my guard down, right? Which means that vulnerability in relationships is going to be lessened, and trust is going to be lessened, and all of a sudden we can find ourselves in conflict with other people. Or this is one that's true for me. If everyone doesn't like me, then something must be wrong with me, right? I have this need to please everyone, and it's something I've had to fight throughout my career, my professional life. If they send me an evaluation of this and there's 99 good comments and one bad one, you know which one I'm going to focus on, right? I'm going to say, oh, what's wrong with me? Everyone didn't like me, right? Instead of understanding that everyone sees things differently. I have to face the fact that every single one of you have some kind of relationship, past experience with religion or with clergy that you may be projecting onto me right now, that you may be saying, maybe you're expecting me to be a certain way or act a certain way, or maybe you presume certain things about a clergy making a presentation today. I can't control that. I can't control that. But believe me, there's an innate part of me that wants to control that. Or this is one that's gotten me in a lot of trouble, and that is people mean well. And I used to believe everyone meant well, that I could trust anybody. I'm a very trusting person, and that's gotten me in a lot of trouble. I've assumed that someone was telling me that it didn't need to be questioned because I know they wouldn't be telling me anything other than the truth. And it turns out that I've been wrong on many occasions by being a little too trusting. We could have a lengthy discussion about the types and the archetypes of stories that we tell. You can probably name a bunch more. But what we often have to ask ourselves is, do the stories we tell emerge from the reality that's in front of us? Or do our stories shape our reality? And really, the fact is, it sort of feeds upon itself. We will have experiences. We will have traumas. We will have tribal identifications that provide us with a pre-written script that we already come to new experiences with. And then out of that, we begin to interpret events, and we start to write a story that interprets the events around us, that lead to a view of reality that is now different than it was before, that now informs the new scripts that we're going to write, which create new stories, which create yet a new view of reality, and the cycle continues to grow and grow and grow. And our experiences continue to write new stories. The question is, can we trust those stories? Do we at some point break up or interrupt those stories to critique and question the scripts that we bring to the realities that we have? So why do we need stories? I'm going to just touch on this briefly. A lot of it is out of our own need for protection and safety. It's a very insecure world we live in. I mean, imagine being in the ancient world and you're just walking along one day and lightning strikes, or the earth moves, or a tsunami rolls in. This complete fear of the unexpected. There's a desire in all of us to create some kind of protection and safety, and then to have control over the world around us. And so we create narratives that give us some sense of understanding to help us cope with uncertainty, with confusion about what may be happening in life. And our stories then become more controllable than perhaps real life is controllable, right? So an example of that is we recruit students every year to be a part of our pastoral care department. We have a robust training program here. We've never had any problems recruiting. Well, in the past couple of years after COVID, we had real trouble recruiting. We saw recruiting numbers go down. We checked around and found out that nationwide, there was this dip in recruiting. Immediately we started telling stories as to why. I went to our national conference back in June, went into a roundtable of 50 adult leaders in pastoral care, and this was the topic of discussion. And everyone had a different story. No one said, hey, I just have no clue. Who knows? Maybe we don't know. Maybe we won't know. No, everyone had a story. This is fewer people are going to seminary, or COVID interrupted the recruiting cycle. Fewer people are going into the ministry. Everyone had a narrative because we needed a narrative, in order to be able to create a plan of action that would fix the problem for the future. But in the end, I have a colleague, David, who's really good at saying, oh, maybe that's true, maybe it's not, right? Do we really know why? There's some uncertainty, right? And in that uncertainty, we find ourselves creating a story that enables us to understand what's the problem and then to be able to develop a plan to control that problem. So stories really are effective for helping us to gain some kind of psychological control over the life around us. But what are the effects ultimately of a storytelling cycle? We have a predetermined script based on our past experiences. We read it into new situations. We start to see confirmation of what we believed was true already, and all of a sudden now we have a new version of reality that impacts the way we see the next situation, and so forth and so on. If we're not careful, these stories can get toxic and they can generate a chronic anxiety. Often the more important something is, and the less we know about it, the higher our anxiety climbs, right? The more important something is, and the less we know about it, the higher our anxiety will climb. I'll quickly tell you my anxiety story. Many years ago, I was pastoring a church and had a wonderful career in front of me. I preached probably the best Easter Sunday sermon I've ever preached. I'm very tell you it was good. And 2 days later, I had a committee, a normal meeting that I was in, and I walked away with no job. I mean, it utterly terrified me. I went from having a career path that was pretty set, a vision for my future, to suddenly not having a job. And in the world of being a pastor, if you have a job, it's easy to get another job. But if you don't have a job, people won't even consider you. So all of a sudden I went from highly marketable and employable to really struggling for anyone to even consider me for a job. That sent me on about a 5-year restructuring of my entire life. Now, the good news is it led me to Penn State Hershey Medical Center, to our training program here, and ultimately to a whole new career in chaplaincy, which I absolutely love. So it's got a good ending. But let me tell you something. I live with chronic anxiety around suddenly losing my job. In fact, I will tell you this story. I got a text one time from my boss. This was a number of years ago. She said, David, can you stop in and see me before morning report? Okay, so normally we arrived at 8 o'clock for morning report. So I showed up at 7:45, and I thought, well, let me get here a little bit. I actually got here about 7:30, and I logged into my computer, and my password didn't work. Oh my goodness. My boss is asking me to come in early. She wanted to have a conversation with me. She didn't tell me what the topic was. And now I can't log, my password no longer works into the system. I want you to know I completely started melting down. I knew I was being fired. This was it. Oh my gosh, my past experience, my past trauma, I immediately took those few facts and I built an entire narrative, and I was sitting there wondering, what have I done? What did I do to get fired? Because I literally believed I was being fired that day. I actually walked out in the hallway and I looked for security, somebody in a security uniform with a box. I just knew it. My life was over and I was going to have to start all over. And I was having a panic attack. I was deeply breathing. I was shaking because I just knew it. Well, I walked in, ironically, to this very office I'm sitting in. My boss was sitting here and I was sitting in the chair right across, and I was scared to absolutely scared to death. And she looked at me in all seriousness and she said, I think you know why you're here. And actually, she was joking with me because it was about something else. I don't even remember what it was, but I just knew right then. Oh, I was in a panic attack. My head was just spinning. I was about to pass out. And she goes, of course you know why I'm here. I need you to help me with the students today. I want you to come 15 minutes early to your lecture, and I need you to help me talk through something. I don't even remember what it was. But it was absolutely nothing. It was absolutely nothing. But I was melting down because of my past experience. And that's what we do. We have a traumatic past experience. We have past events that occur, and we have just a few data points, and we fill in a huge story to explain those data points. And often that story just isn't true. And if you're like me, I live with chronic anxiety around just that very thing. I have a monthly one-on-one meeting with my supervisor, and it's like clockwork. The night or two before that meeting, I wake up at 3 a.m. and worried. It's a chronic anxiety because there's a story. It's a story that I tell myself that's not a helpful story. And I have to constantly do some of my own cognitive behavioral therapy to say, David, you are not in a church. You do not have 1,000 bosses. You do not have people that can just walk in and surprise you. You have a good relationship with Penn State Health. You have a good relationship with your boss. Calm down, right? This chronic storytelling cycle creates high anxiety for us. It also can create hurt relationships. I had a colleague one time that I actually had to fire. This was many years ago. I was a brand new pastor, and we had a leader in our church who was what I would call the natural leader of the organization, was somebody who had been there for 30 years. Everyone respected them. And I had a high level of respect for this person. I knew they're the one that you have to get on your side, or you're not going to be able to accomplish anything. And so I got to know that person very, very well. Meanwhile, my colleague had a bad experience with a key leader in an organization and said, I can't trust that person. I can't trust him. And so my associate essentially went to war with the de facto leader of the church and ended up doing exactly what I'm talking about, self-sabotage, and actually created the environment that got himself terminated from his position. So we can hurt we can hurt our relationships by projecting onto people a story that we think is going to be true about them. And then that leads to exactly what I was just saying, harmful self-fulfilling prophecies. So what can we do? So let's talk about how we can intercept our stories, intercept our narratives, and ultimately have calm that inner anxiety and have some openness about what's in front of us. And first of all, it is to be able to identify the story that you are telling. You're telling a story. You have stories for everything. Are you aware of them? Do you know the story that you tell? Do you know the story that's driving you, that impacts the way you engage situations, engage your colleagues, engage your family, individuals? Are you aware of the stories? And the second, do you question the stories that you tell about other people? Do you question those narratives that you automatically form when you engage certain situations or certain individuals? So what I'm going to invite you to is to get out of your head and into the here and now. Now, what do I mean by that? You'll see there I put practice good listening. Meaning, oftentimes when we engage a situation, we already have a narrative that's forming that we're telling ourselves about the situation or about the other person or about who we're dealing with. And we start letting that narrative talk its way through. But what if instead of doing that, we started with a clean slate, a blank slate, and we began to just simply be in the here and now, recognize this is a new person, this is a new situation. Yes, we have our past experiences that we can draw from, but I want to treat this as if it's something new. And I want to practice good listening, meaning I want to hear what the person says with their point of view, not with my lens filtering what they're saying. I want to hear about the situation, and I want to suspend all of my storytelling so I can really hear what's real and what's present. It's really a discipline of mindfulness, of being open in new situations to hearing something new. and not just your past experience coming into the present. And then I think this is most important, is to gain awareness of your emotional triggers and the effects that past trauma has on the way you engage others. Without this awareness, you are walking dangerously into your future. Because if you're not aware, one thing that we find, you ever hear this comment? I don't know how come people don't understand this. It's just common sense, right? It's just common sense. What I've come to believe about common sense is we've told ourselves a narrative that is so real to us that we think it should be real to everyone else, right? Well, it's just common sense. You can't trust that person. Well, that's because we have brought our past so clearly into the future that we are so unaware of that we think everyone shares the same perspective we do. So when you find yourself saying it's just common sense, right? That may be a great point to go, okay, am I being aware of the story I'm bringing into the situation? Am I aware of what's triggering me, the effects of my past trauma? And then I would offer you this, practice the golden rule. And that is this, do you want others writing your story? I mean, imagine you switch the situation around. Do you want other people projecting their past experiences onto you and determining for you what your motives are, determining for you how you're going to engage and behave in what motives that you have for a current situation? You wouldn't appreciate that at all. You're like, no, give me a fresh start. Give me an opportunity to write my story. Let me tell you my story. We wouldn't want others writing our stories for us and projecting their issues onto us. So we should be careful to practice not writing our stories on other people, giving them an opportunity, a clean slate, a chance to start fresh and new with us, and not to project what we think is the truth onto them. What we're ultimately talking about is a deconstruction process of separating what is not true from what we say is true. Embracing critical thinking, where we're constantly asking ourselves, how do I know that? I'm assuming that is true, but how do I know that? Where did I get that idea? Constantly asking ourselves, is this really true? I'm presuming this, is it right? I offer this, beliefs are opinions that we give our loyalty to over time. What I'm inviting you to is hold the solid beliefs that you have about the world and about other people and hold them loosely. To see them not as definitive answers, but as strong opinions that you hold. See, if every belief you have is an absolute opinion or is an absolute conclusion, you're not going to be open to new information. But if what you see as your core beliefs you recognize as strong personal opinions, then there's an openness there. There's an openness to receive new information that may change your opinion over time and to be open. I'm ultimately inviting you to openness. And I close with this thought. I recently saw Forrest Gump again after many years. I think it's a 30-year-old movie. And I remember seeing it way back then, but I saw it recently from the lens of a chaplain and the lens of my experience. And I was fascinated by Forrest Gump because Forrest Gump goes through, one major world event after another, experiences them firsthand all through the 60s and 70s, and seems to come out pretty well. But none of the people around him seem to come out well. So if you look at the bottom left, there's Jenny. If you know the movie, Jenny is a mess. Jenny has severe past trauma, and it just makes her run from every intimate relationship she has. You see the quote there. She says to Forrest, "If you're ever in trouble, don't be brave, just run. Just run." And that's her philosophy of life. That's her story. You can't trust anyone. I just got to run. Then there's Lieutenant Dan. Lieutenant Dan, he says, I was supposed to die in the field with honor. That's my destiny. And he's really upset at Forrest Gump for not letting him die in the field and live this narrative that he had created. His narrative got got interrupted, and all of these people around him are trying to make meaning, deep meaning, out of all the conflicts that they're facing. And then I thought the most poignant moment of the movie was when Bubba Gump, this is Forrest's best friend, again, not the smartest guy in the room, about the same intelligence level as Forrest Gump. He's dying on the battlefield. This is a guy that loved to farm shrimp on his boat, shrimp boat. That was a purpose for his life. And here he is dying on the Vietnam battlefield. And he looks at Forrest Gump and he says, Forrest, why did this happen? I mean, it's the ultimate existential question. Why? Can you make sense of this? Is there any meaning and purpose? Can you tell a story that makes this make sense? I need it to make sense. Even Bubba Gump needed that sense of understanding and control. What did Forrest say? Well, Bubba, you got shot. In other words, he had no ability to create the narrative of meaning. He didn't have the ability to create a story. And ironically, that is where Forrest Gump was able to find joy in his life, is that he was incapable of writing full narrative stories about his life. He just took one moment at a time. What do you always say? Life is like a box of chocolates. You just never know what you're going to get. That was the philosophy of his life. And then finally, at the end, I think it's the critical moment of the film. Forrest decides to run. He's just running. He runs from back and forth across the country 3 or 4 times. The media is asking Forrest Gump, why are you running? Are you running, for world peace? Are you running for the environment? Are you running to save the world? Why are you running? Finally, he just tells them, I just felt like running. And everyone was so upset at him because that's not the story they wanted. I draw from Forrest Gump that there's an invitation for us to let go a little bit of our storytelling, to hold those stories loosely, because then when we hold them loosely, we can experience the world in front of us afresh and anew each time, unconditionally accepting the people in front of us, embracing new experiences without projecting all the past onto it, and allowing life to come at us fresh and new. So my invitation to you is simply this. Can you critique your stories and then open yourselves up to writing new stories about your life, about your reality, about your relationships, and about your future? Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. That was a great presentation. Appreciate your knowledge. We appreciate your personal stories tying in those movies. Really made for a great presentation. And I see some people in the chat box, they are agreeing with us. So if there's no questions or other comments, we thank you all for your time. And again, another thank you to David for this wonderful presentation. We will be putting the recording on our website and sending it out within the next week. So if you missed the first half or just want to watch it again, you will be getting that recording along with the PowerPoint slides as well. So with that, again, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day.